Welcome to the Cannabis Detector podcast. No sugar, all spice. With the industry BS detector in residence, Kristen Yoder.
Hello, my Cannabis detectors. Thank you so much for joining me today. I have a very special guest, Tanya Hoke. She's a managing director at Galen Diligence in Cambridge, Massachusetts. Welcome to the show.
Thanks, Kristen. It's awesome to be here.
Yes, I found you on LinkedIn. You were continuously posting about all the crazy political issues that people are having. And one of the posts was, what state was it? Pennsylvania or something, where it showed the actual reasons why people got denied licenses?
Michigan. Yeah, that was Michigan.
Yeah, so that was really interesting. And at first I thought you were a lawyer until I found out you did investigative due diligence. So why don't you tell us what that is exactly?
Sure, yeah. So I'm not a lawyer, but I work with a lot of lawyers. I'm actually a private investigator and a fraud examiner and a money laundering specialist. And investigative due diligence is essentially the gold standard for vetting management teams. You basically go beyond the basic background check to identify issues relating to the business or legal or reputational risks associated with a CEO or a CFO or a board of directors. And major financial institutions often do this kind of due diligence on executives before a company goes public in the United States. And it's also something that people use in a pre-investment or pre-partnership due diligence context.
It's got to be really interesting because I love doing due diligence, but I don't have any investigative background. So obviously, I can't go nearly as deep as you would or even know where to look. But have you ever uncovered just some really egregious stuff and you were just mind blown?
Yes. And it's not just in cannabis, although the bulk of my work is cannabis related now. But I mean, the best example that I have from the last few years was for a client out of Canada that was getting ready to invest in a cultivation operation on the West Coast. This was, I think, 2 years ago. It was going to be a multi-million-dollar investment, and they came to me for the first time a couple of weeks before they were signing this deal. So they'd already pretty much negotiated the contract before they kind of looked around and said, maybe we should do some background checks. And they had me take a look at three of the senior executives, and one of them had this super common name that if you were to Google it, it would just overwhelm you with results and you'd probably be looking at the wrong person. And I was able to figure out that this person had changed their name around the time they came to the West Coast, and they didn't have any background in cannabis. But what they did have was an open felony criminal case against them on the East Coast for real estate fraud, an open civil case from someone else for a different real estate fraud. And they'd also been implicated in a criminal matter involving a couple of people on the FBI's most wanted list.
Oh my God.
They were big money laundering risk, fraud risk, every kind of risk you can imagine for this particular client. And that was one where the client walked away, and wisely so. But that one was probably in the top three issues that I found in a dozen years of doing this work.
Yeah, well, how did you get into cannabis due diligence?
Yeah, so I mean, back in 2014, I had a client who came to me who was involved with one of the private equity firms that was sort of the bigger players on the scene at the time, who was investing in the industry, and he came to me because they were looking at an investment in Colorado, and he asked me to take a look at the CEO of a group of dispensaries out there. And my background, I used to work for a large security and investigations firm in New York, and a lot of the work that I did there was fraud and pre-investment investigations, but mostly in industries like mining or oil and gas or pharmaceuticals. So looking at an early cannabis operator was fascinating.
Oh,
and And it was one of those ones where one of those early experiences that really kind of blew up the preconceived notions I had about the kind of issues I was going to find in this industry.
What were those?
Well, I was expecting to find things like convictions for cultivation or distribution, which would be disqualifying issues for a client in the pharmaceutical industry, but aren't necessarily in this industry. And what I wasn't expecting to find was executives who had more issues around fraud and misleading investors, which I should have expected. It was my foolishness, right?
This industry is rife with that. I mean, it's the next thing to exploit and make money.
Exactly. Yeah. What I've really found in looking at dozens of these now for clients over the last 4 or 5 years is that it's not the folks who are coming into the regulated industry who have prior experience in the illicit industry that have the biggest issues. It's folks who say, oh, look, cannabis is the new buzzword that I can slap on my money raising opportunities. Before this, it was blockchain. And before that, it was, junior mining companies out of Canada. Cannabis is just the new word that I slap on the press release. And if you look into those folks, oftentimes what you find is kind of a string of disappointed investors and lawsuits.
But so there's a website called theblacklist.xyz, and they made this website as a place to anonymously warn people about people that have been ripped off by people. And I always thought that's such a good idea and so necessary, because a lot of times people don't want to report people that have ripped them off to the FBI or the police or whatever. They don't want to get involved with that. So a lot of people just take the hits and keep moving on, even though their lives are destroyed. And what I like about that website is that's at least somewhere I would really like to see more professionals utilize that and, keep it anonymous, but on your end, but let people know. I don't know how else we're going to find out about these people ripping people off if people aren't reporting them in the first place.
No, I absolutely agree. And it's actually one of the challenges of the kind of work that I do. I'm sort of at the intersection of private investigations and investigative journalism, but there are limits because the only companies that I investigate are ones that my clients are considering, and the report is then owned by the client and it's confidential. So there are operators out there that it frustrates me no end that they're continuing to raise money when I know that there are issues there that are troubling. And it's just part of my responsibility to not dig into that publicly when I've been retained by a client for a particular purpose. There's a difference between me and a journalist or just being sort of a public advocate. The nice thing, though, is that when I see wrongdoing or something that looks unusual or suspicious, and it isn't a situation where I've been retained, then that's a time when I can sort of work on educating people about what's going on. And that's what you'll have seen in my posts on LinkedIn and on Twitter.
Yeah, that's why I love your posts. They remind me of posts I make, except you're way deeper in it. God, there's so many fraudulent companies out there that I would love to just know how to dig deeper and call it out, but I don't know. I have a question. So, you're by law, you can't do specific background checks on people, right? If you're going to hire them or something.
Right. So there are different contexts for doing the kind of work that I do, and there are different regulations depending on the context. So you're absolutely right. The kind of investigations that I do can't be done if you're getting ready to hire someone. So actually, I don't do pre-employment background checks at all for that reason. Those are regulated.
Is that?
So they're regulated under the Fair Credit Reporting Act. And that puts limits on the kind of information that can be reported in the background check and how far back in time you can report on issues. So the rules vary by state, but as an example, oftentimes you can't report a bankruptcy that's more than 7 or 10 years old, or you can't report that someone was arrested if they weren't also convicted. And the reason for that, I mean, it makes a lot of sense, right? If you're someone who's applying for a job and you've been arrested but not convicted, then you're presumed innocent and it shouldn't be held against you when you apply for that job. So that's the reason for that. The context in which I do investigative due diligence is never employment. So it's either an acquisition or an investment. And in that context, the kind of information that I can report and how far back in time I can go is different. So it's still regulated information, but for example, I can go back 20 years. If it's in the public record, I can report on arrests that didn't result in a conviction. I can report on things that are older than you could if it was a pre-employment background check. And I can, again, as long as it's public, I can put together information from your social media posts and from media archives and anything that's in the public domain to create a pretty comprehensive picture of someone's professional career. And that level of depth isn't something that you can get in a pre-employment background check. And that's usually what people are getting. If you're doing like an online, it takes 24 hours or less, $50 background check. It's a pre-employment level of check.
Yeah. Well, I always just wondered, I mean, can't you just Google someone and then see their background? I mean, you can pay $1 for those websites and they'll give you all the information they can find. So I'm just curious why.
Yeah. So there's different levels.
That.
Well, why people don't do that, I can't answer that. Every now and then, the things that I find are, like, if you had Googled and gone even on the first page of results, you didn't need to hire me to tell you this particular thing. Not everything is online still, especially in the United States. Every county in the country has its own court records system. And those aren't directly accessible through Google, for example. And some of them don't even have their files online. So a big part of what I do is figuring out where someone has lived for the last 20 years, say, and which counties those are, and then go on and find those. The other thing I'd say about some of the online search platforms that are available to people who don't have a license, so like a people search kind of thing, is that it can be really difficult to make sure that you're looking at the person you actually think you're looking at in that context. If you don't have their full date of birth, for example, or a social security number, and they have a relatively common name, you have no idea what results you're getting. And with that said, a lot of news reporting is online, especially recent news, and Google is a great place to start for just a gut check on anyone that you're thinking of partnering with, regardless of the industry.
Yeah, I actually had a doctor I got connected with who wanted to work with me in coming up with a CME accredited terpene class. And I'm like, that would be great. And I told my mentor and he was like, yeah, well, just make sure you check his background and that everything is good. And I was like, oh yeah, duh, right? So then I look him up and the dude has so many felonies for drug charges.
Man.
And then when I confronted him, he made up all these lies because I already did a bunch of research and he was I was like, oh my God, I was so close to partnering with a total drug addict felon. And all I had to do was Google his name. And the first page was like multiple news articles about him. And then I found all kinds of paperwork. So it's really important.
Really it is.
Yeah. So how many people do you talk to that really just like don't respect due diligence or really just want to rush through it?
Well, I think it's not necessarily that people want to rush through it, but that they don't think to do it until they're under a real time crunch. So a lot of the times when clients work with me for the first time, they're literally days from signing a contract, and somebody probably on one of their attorneys said, "Hey, have you looked into these guys just to check?" And they haven't done that, and then they decide they're going to do it. And ideally, I mean, for the kind of work that I do, we like to have at least a couple of weeks, if not 3 weeks, to really do it, because we're digging around in archives of various kinds. And like I said, those aren't always online. The other thing that I run into is like people either tend to get the importance of vetting the executives that they're going to be working with or investing in, or they don't really care. And sometimes that's because they've done really well going with their gut for a while.
Yeah.
Or it's that, you know, they're investing in something that a buddy of theirs has already invested in. And I see that quite a bit in the cannabis space, I think, in part because there's sort of a lot of people are investing on their own still, and they're relying on word of mouth, and they sort of say, well, you know, I'm investing because so-and-so invested, and they wouldn't have invested if they hadn't vetted. So there's this assumption that someone vetted originally, right? And in those circumstances, I always think of something like Theranos, right? Where you put together a board of directors or what have you, and it sort of snowballs where everyone's looking at saying, well, so-and-so wouldn't be involved if it wasn't legit. And it turns out that no one did the check in the first place to make sure that there was really something good there.
That was something I learned also, is a lot of these companies will get incredibly impressive people to get on their board just to get their faces on their pitch deck, you know, to increase investor trust. And I mean, I've just learned so much in the past 2-3 years working with startups, entrepreneurs, investors, et cetera. And it's just such a dirty industry. And I found that while I try to prevent people from getting screwed over in this industry, everyone has to get screwed over once just to learn the lesson, because you really don't know how bad you can get burned until you get burned, which is unfortunate, but that's how I learn. Right. I learn by making mistakes, you know, but these are major financial issues that are not good to learn on, you know.
And what I often tell people, I mean, there's some basic things that you can do. Like you said, Google's a great place to start. Another one, like you said, there are decks floating around with some very impressive directors or what have you on them. Like, one thing I would look at is, do any of those directors have experience either in cannabis specifically or in a highly regulated, compliance-driven industry, right? You want to see a board of directors that can actually advise the executive team on the things that it's going to take to stay in business. And in this industry, compliance is a big piece of that. And I also look for, do they have a senior executive on the team whose number one role is compliance? So a chief compliance officer, a general counsel who has a compliance or regulatory background rather than exclusively like a deal and M&A background. And those are things that you can do yourself. You don't need to hire someone like me to tell you, although I will happily do so.
Yeah. Yeah, it's just putting in the work, and a lot of people don't want to for some reason. I find it endlessly fascinating. There's so much dirt online about people that, I mean, I'm still shocked, and that's crazy because I have no faith in anybody for the most part. So, but you know, like, that's not a good way to live, not trusting anybody. So right when I start trusting people, I meet another fraudulent person, and I'm like, damn, man, you know, but you said this isn't specific to cannabis, and you worked in financial industries where there's a ton of criminals. I mean, money brings out the worst in people, I think.
Yeah, it's an incentive structure that I think it can be easy to defer moral judgment when you see something that's making money, right? And you sort of say, well, if they're making money, they must be doing something right. But the two don't necessarily go together.
Yeah, like Bernie Madoff or Enron.
For example,
right?
If it's too good to be true, it's definitely too good to be true.
Yes. Oh my God. There's a podcast called American Scandal, and I'm obsessed with it. And they're going over Enron right now, which it's just so interesting. And I think this is another reason why these financial guys are getting into the cannabis industry, because it takes someone very, not necessarily, I mean, smart, obviously, but someone who knows how to play within well-regulated, highly regulated industries. But it's like you have to know the rules to break them. And I think they're bringing their bad habits into this industry because it's not nearly as regulated now because they don't have the enforcement to really go in there and start, shutting people down. The people are going to exploit this time in our industry where it's all still really like messy and gray, especially with CBD. So how many CBD companies have you had to do due diligence on? Because they're full of shady people.
Yeah, they are. So CBD's been a bit of a newer one. In the first few years, we were mostly looking at privately held extraction companies. Then there was a wave of multi-state operators that we looked at. And the last few months, we did sort of a handful of CBD-focused companies. And there's a big range there in terms of the quality of the management and what their operational expertise is, I would say. I think the interesting thing with the CBD piece is that people are making the assumption that the Farm Bill means that it's sort of all green lights all the way down, when really part of the funny thing, I read an OSHA complaint for the first time when diligencing a CBD company, where this is a company out west that one of their employees had filed a safety complaint with the federal government, essentially saying that their facility, the factory where they had people working, was unsafe. And an inspector went to go check it out, and the company's executives wouldn't let the inspector in to look at things. And these guys were working with hemp. And it's usually a bad idea not to let the federal inspector check out your factory. And the federal government ended up getting a warrant to go in and evaluate the facility. And it wasn't the first time that they'd had safety violations there. So that's one example of a compliance category that people sort of don't necessarily think about when it comes to hemp and CBD. That legal doesn't mean unregulated. So just because CBD is quote unquote legal doesn't mean that it's allowed in every category, regardless of what you want to put it in and everything else. And again, like you said, we're looking at another buzzword that people are sort of slapping onto things and not necessarily thinking about whether it's a viable business or who is running that business and how well they're running it.
Yeah, I keep trying to tell people legalization does not decriminalize. It just makes, so many more laws that you have to follow that It's kind of easy to break them if you're from the illicit market in the first place and you want to transfer over.
You can break it by accident, and then you can have executives who don't necessarily prioritize compliance in the first place.
That's the thing in California, especially, is any legacy business owners, meaning before Prop 64 passed, I truly honestly believe, and most people agree with me, that the majority of them are sociopaths. And I say this because they could have been arrested at any time. There was no protections unless you had a really good lawyer. And most people are not cool with that type of risk. That's why the business people come in after something gets regulated. So there are all of these guys that they were never business people. A lot of them are just egotistical assholes, and they're impossible to work with. And now they're getting a ton of investment, and it's just amplifying their terribleness and it's like investing in a really shitty company, but the guy is such a good salesperson. And is good at pitching investors. And that's what I'm seeing is, you could go back on a lot of these guys and find a lot of things, but for some reason they keep getting investment money. And it's like, dude, did anyone look at the operations? Has anyone talked to their employees? Because they're miserable and the company is run poorly. But that's not something you look into, right? With investigative due diligence, you're not looking at operational things.
Right. So we don't do we don't evaluate the business plan. The way I usually explain it to clients is, ideally, the client is doing the work of assessing sort of the viability of the business, whether they're targeting the right markets and that kind of thing. And then there's a lawyer helping with the contracts and an accountant going over the books. every now and then I get a client who comes in because we want to make sure that the grow facility is good. And in those cases, I refer them to some people that I know who are experienced growers and have sort of an expertise in diligencing that particular segment. And I would do the same anytime someone came and said, it's an extraction business. I want to make sure their extraction processes are good. Okay, then we've got someone for that. My piece is really exclusively focused on the people. The space where those kinds of things around, are the employees happy? What's their reputation like actually in the industry? Because people hear things, would come in sort of at the next level of due diligence. And we don't do this for all of our clients, but sometimes the client goes through the initial due diligence process and maybe we find some issues and maybe we don't, but the client may have heard something that in the process of negotiating the deal that caused them some concern. And we might go out and say, okay, we will do some discreet asking around in the industry and see what people have to say about how this business is run and what's going on with that. And sometimes in those contexts, what you do is you figure out who has sued these people and what do they have to say about it, or who's been leaving the company, right? Who has left the company within the last year, and how are they describing their experience? But even without doing that, you can go on Glassdoor, which is a job search site where people anonymously review their prior employment, Glassdoor and Indeed both. And you can read what people have written about their experiences working in these places. And you can take it with a grain of salt because sometimes it's people who got fired and you need to have that context. But a number of times I've come across multiple allegations of pesticide violations, for example, or sexual harassment in the work culture at a cannabis company. And that's something that once you see more than one of those, it's the kind of thing that an investor or an acquirer should definitely know about and ask more about.
Yeah, for sure. I definitely think people need to spend a lot more time looking into things. I get contacted every day, multiple times a day by people that want to get into the cannabis industry. And I'm always like, okay, well, can you afford to take a pay cut? Because you're not going to make as much money because everyone wants to get into the cannabis industry. Mm-hmm. And are you passionate about the plant? Because you're going to deal with a ton of bullshit. And if you don't have the passion, it's not even worth it. It really isn't. I mean, you have to get used to a completely unprofessional industry. So many professional people are like, it's so unprofessional, but like you're coming into our industry. We're not going into yours. Like you can't mold our industry to your expectations. That will give you a major breakdown. Exactly. Adapt by lowering your expectations to like 10%. And then you'll rarely be disappointed. And maybe pleasantly surprised sometimes.
Yeah, exactly.
But not as often, but yes. So we need to wrap things up, but I have one last question.
Sure.
Is it expensive to get investigative due diligence? I mean, obviously, within context, you could save people a shit ton of money. So obviously, there's great value to it.
Yeah, it really depends. For us, our pricing is based around how many people or companies you want us to look at. So we have clients who come to us and they say, okay, I only ever want to look at the CEO. And in that setting, it's relatively affordable. We have other clients who, when they're making major investments, they say, okay, we want to look at the whole executive team, right? And that gets more expensive. I'd say, the price is proportional to the risk that you're willing to tolerate and the size of the investment you're making. So if you're only investing $5,000, then be prepared to lose it, and you're not going to put much insurance on that by doing diligence with us.
Yeah.
Most of our clients are investing several $1 million or more, and that's the point at which they start to see that this kind of due diligence makes sense for them. And there's different levels of diligence, and I'm always happy to talk people through what might make sense for their budget. But I think everyone has a different risk tolerance, and you have to be kind of honest with yourself about what you're willing to lose. And keep in mind that it's not just financial, it's also reputational. If you give money to the wrong person and everyone finds out about it, that's an awkward conversation. If you're
Definitely.
investing only your own money, that's one thing. If you're investing other people's money, then you have a whole different level of liability in terms of the steps that you take to be wise about where you put that money.
Yeah, I mean, when people hit me up to pick my brain, I'm like, well, let's do a power hour for $250
Right.
and then you can pick my brain. And then they don't want
Exactly.
to. And I'm like, no offense, but you literally can't afford to get into the cannabis industry if
Right.
you think $250 for my insight is too expensive. But like, good luck on that one.
Well,
and same with
I'll
you,
say,
right?
I mean, I think one of the things that is also very true is people see all these different M&A deals and what have you going on, and they're multi-million-dollar deals. And then sometimes if you dig into the financial filings up in Canada for some of these publicly traded companies, you can see what percentage of the deal was spent on legal fees. And legal fees often includes whatever due diligence they did. And I saw a deal, it was like a $5 million acquisition that spent only $30,000 on legal fees. And that's not a whole heck of a lot to protect yourself. And I think part of it too is a lot of these deals are happening all in stock. And attorneys and people like you and me don't get paid in stock. And so if you're paying for everything with shares of your company, there's a point where you're going to run out of the ability to protect yourself with sound legal or expertise advice, because some folks, we accept payment in invoices, not in shares. So.
Yeah, in a currency that I can use to buy stuff with. Yes, totally.
Exactly.
Well, let people know, how can they find you?
Sure. So you can find me on my website. It's GalenDiligence.com, and then I'm on Twitter at Tanya H, TanyAH, and you can find me on LinkedIn. And I imagine there'll be some links in your podcast notes or what have you.
Yep. Yeah. So everyone check out the notes to find her contact information and get an overview of what we talked about. Thank you so much for coming on. I think this will be really helpful for a lot of people because I'm continuously shattering people's dreams with reality. But I think that's necessary, because dreams don't pay the bills until you make them a reality, and reality is a bitch sometimes.
That's true. And there are gems out there. There are gems of companies in cannabis, and you just have to dig long enough to find them and try not to get burned too badly on the way to finding them.
Yeah, don't be like me, kids. No, I'm just kidding. All right. Well, thank you, everyone, for tuning in. And join us next episode. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Kristen.
If you've enjoyed this episode, please be sure to subscribe and leave a review on your favorite podcast host. It really helps us get the truth out to a larger audience. You can follow us on Instagram at CannabisPod and on LinkedIn at the Cannabis Detector. Show notes and links to articles referenced in this episode are available on our website, cannabispod.com. Is there a topic you want to hear, or do you have some BS you'd like to tell our audience? Send us a message on Instagram at CannabisPod. Stay skeptical.